One thing one could do would be to improve the road infrastructure from that area to, ports, to Dhaka, et cetera, which the government actually has done recently with the opening of the Padma Bridge. The Padma Bridge was financed entirely from equity from the government, which is a fairly risky decision normally. Typically, governments look to borrow money in order to fund infrastructure development, because if they borrow money, they can pay the money back over time, match the expenses with the tax receipts. If they pay the entire cost up front, they're basically taking a bet that they will get the tax receipts to be able to recover the cost over time. In this case, that seems like a good bet because it's predicted that the Bangladeshi gross domestic product will go up by perhaps as much as 2% per annum because of the increased economic activity derived from this bridge being created to link Khulna to the rest of the country. So the western part of the country will benefit from this more generally. It's also the case that this facilitates things like an investment in cold chain. So there is an international logistics company which is planning on starting a cold chain in Bangladesh within the next 2 years. That will result in a pretty significant increase in the value of the seafood products from that part of the country. So that's an example of kind of why infrastructure is important. If the Bangladeshi government started printing massive amounts of taka, one consequence would be that the exchange rate between the taka and the dollar would deteriorate. So it wouldn't necessarily be the case that the government could buy a lot of dollars with those increased taka. So in the case of a country like Bangladesh, you need to have some comfort level that you eventually will have the cash flows to be able to repay it, which usually is tied to this question of whether it generates an economic benefit that can result in more taxes. Up until 2 years ago, debt was basically free. So interest rates for sovereign borrowers were very low. The U.S., in fact, was borrowing at U.S., Germany, were borrowing money on long-term basis at negative interest rates. People were paying them basically to take the money, and over time they were paying less money than they borrowed. Naturally, when you're in that situation, you should borrow as much as you can because there's really no cost to it. That would have been a little less the case for Bangladesh, but even for Bangladesh, interest rates were very, very low. It was possible to get very long-term debt. In that situation, there's not as much fiscal pressure. The fiscal pressure kind of arises from this question of what the tax revenues are and then the balance of payments. So how much are we importing, for which we have to use dollars or another currency, versus how much are we exporting? If those two don't balance, that puts pressure on the government because it needs to find dollars somewhere to match that imbalance. So to use that specific example, Bangladesh is currently it currently has an imbalance of balance of payments. So up until last year, Bangladesh was normally in a surplus position, so there was limited pressure on the taka. It was exporting as much or more than it was importing, taking into account the percentage of imports that was used to create exports. That shifted in the last year. So at the moment, Bangladesh actually is having a reduction in its balance in payments, which implies that its dollar reserves are declining. What the government has done in reaction to that was to tamp down on imports, which has the consequence of sort of rectifying that imbalance, and it's expected that that will be corrected by the end of this year. Not every country is in that position, so I don't know if you've seen Sri Lanka in the news recently. Sri Lanka had a major balance of payments crisis, and its economy, in effect, collapsed because of that. Bangladesh, thankfully, is not in that sort of a situation. It's got quite a healthy fiscal position.